Question for you, switching gears here a little bit. When did you first hear the term fentanyl?
It would have been in the mid 80s. We had this is a funny story too, you think about it. There was a actual real chemist that worked for DuPont. Um, in the early 80s, he worked for DuPont and had laboratory privileges at a DuPont plant, and I believe outside of Boston. And he was the first one that actually put fentanyl together. Of course, it had been a pharmaceutical and had been in research for long periods of time, but he got into the lab and was able to get the precursors and made a batch of it. And he had, because of who he was, he had no way to get it on the street. So what he did was he began a cat and mouse game with some people that turned out to be our informants. But there were several batches that he sold, and I think there was 20 to 30 overdoses, many of them fatal, within a certain period of time. And we were eventually able to figure out who it was. And so it had disappeared. And then in the 90s, there was a similar situation in Chicago. It was in the 92, 93, where we had a series of overdoses over one weekend surrounding one area of the west side of Chicago. And that was controlled by one particular street gang, the Gangster Disciples. And I think in a 2-day period, 26 people overdosed and 11 of them died. So we started getting on them, and we listened to their phones, and lo and behold, one of their members, believe it or not, made a phone call to a location in Mexico, which turned out to be the lab. So we were able to get with the Mexicans, and within a matter of weeks, we shut down that whole thing. And of course, the public forgot about it very quickly, but I can tell you that sent shockwaves through everybody, because anybody that understood what fentanyl could do, specifically if it could be produced, what it could do to the heroin and opiate problem that we were already experiencing was awful. So Chapo, believe it or not, and others like him, saw the opioid issue in the United States based off prescription drug abuse. And so they kind of slowed down the importation of cocaine, and they ramped up the production of poppy, leading to heroin. And the Colombians obviously were involved in heroin. So they began putting high potency, cheap heroin on the street, knowing full well that many of the people that were addicted to prescription drugs couldn't get them. It was too expensive.
Yep.
And they would turn, because it was an opioid, and they would turn to it. And so we saw an explosion. Specifically, I was a boss in Chicago at the time, and it was not just the inner city, it was every social economic group you could think of, from a couple undercover tapes I should send you, where they showed up, social media said, hey, we're going to be on the corner, or walk and don't walk at 7:00. Guys in pilot uniform for United showed up, nurses. Rich housewives would drive in. It was unbelievable. And that was all Chapo's doing. And that was when he was producing heroin. And then shortly after that, we began to see heroin laced with fentanyl. And now we're seeing fentanyl laced with heroin. That's how far it's come.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the book, but I read a fascinating book, and it basically talked about how the crackdown on the overprescription of opioids led to, I believe it was black tar heroin, and they'd keep it in their mouth. The dealers would keep it in their mouth, but they would literally go and park their cars at the pill mills that people were now getting pushed away from, because the doctors, the pendulum was swinging in the other direction. And so they're just dealing black tar heroin in the parking lot of pharmacies.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's a big problem, because if you look at what that evolved in, black tar heroin was usually constricted to a small user base because it's very hard to use. It primarily comes out of the Durango region of Mexico, transported by several different families over 50 years, but it exploded because of its opioid addiction. So now when you have people like Guzmán coming up with cheap, potent heroin, they weren't using needles to ingest it. They were smoking and snorting it just like cocaine. So gone were the fears of AIDS or hepatitis using a needle. So you had this completely different user base on down to high school kids in the suburbs who were beginning to experiment with it. And it exploded. It really exploded. And at the time, I was very concerned, obviously, for our agents and law enforcement in general. I can't tell you how many police chiefs, when I was a deputy, called because they had canine dogs that had expired
Yeah.
because they searched a car and the guy, like the movies, the guy would sniff it, boom, down goes he, and then the dog's down. So it was a completely different change thing for law enforcement, how we're going to deal with it. How do we test it? And then obviously, the whole issue with the addiction and the overdose deaths, it still hasn't subsided. I think it's worse. And quite frankly, our relationship with China isn't making it better because that's where the chemicals come from, and they're now going directly into Mexico.